Ben held the map up to the light with 2 fingers. It was falling apart. The paper had separated at every fold line, the sections held together by nothing but habit and hope. The ink had faded to the point where some sections were barely legible. There were water stains, a tear along the bottom edge, and what appeared to be a burn mark in the upper left corner that someone had at some point tried to repair with tape that had long since yellowed and curled away from the paper. He set it down carefully, not out of respect for the object, but because he didn't want pieces of it on his work surface. "Sir, I understand this is important to you, but there's nothing I can do with this. The paper is too fragile to mount. The fold damage is too extensive to repair properly. If I tried to frame this, it would continue to deteriorate inside the frame, and you'd end up with fragments. I can't in good conscience take your money for a job that won't work." He smiled, the professional smile of someone who had delivered this verdict many times and had learned to do it kindly. The old man on the other side of the counter didn't move. He was perhaps 80, perhaps older, a plain brown cardigan over a white shirt, dark trousers, shoes polished to a standard that spoke of long habit. His hands were on the counter, and they were the hands of someone very old, thin, the skin loose over the bones, but they were resting there with a stillness that was not weakness. He said, "Look inside the folds first." Ben almost didn't. He had a queue of 7 jobs, and this one was already running over time. But something in the old man's voice, quiet, patient, the specific quality of someone who has been carrying a fact for a long time and is finally in the room where the fact matters, made him reach for the map. He lifted the first fold carefully. Between the 2 layers of paper, pressed flat by decades of being folded, was a small piece of paper, not part of the map, a separate piece, folded separately, kept inside the fold the way you keep something you need to not lose. He unfolded it. He read it. He set it down. He looked at the old man. He said, "Who drew this map?" The old man said, "My mother." And then he said what his mother had done, and where she had done it, and when. And Ben stood at his framing counter in his small shop and felt the specific sensation of having been about to dismiss something that turned out to be one of the most significant objects he had ever held in his hands. What was written on that piece of paper? And what had the old man's mother done in 1944 that nobody had talked about for 80 years? Drop your city in the comments. And if you believe that some maps lead to places that official history forgot to record, subscribe. Because what Ben found inside those folds changed everything about what he thought he was being asked to frame. The framing shop on Calder Street had been called simply B. Novak Framing since Ben had opened it 11 years ago, the B standing for Benjamin, the Novak being his father's name and his grandfather's before that. It was a narrow shop in a row of similar narrow shops, the kind of street that had been slowly transforming for the better part of 2 decades and had arrived at a state of partial transformation. Some storefronts renovated and bright, some still in their original condition, the whole street carrying the particular character of a place that had not yet decided what it was becoming. Ben was 38 years old. He had come to framing through a circuitous route that had included a degree in fine arts, 3 years working for a larger framing operation in the city centre, and the specific realization that he wanted to run his own operation with his own standards rather than compromise on quality for throughput. He was a craftsman in the precise sense of someone who had developed a specific skill over a long period and cared about performing it correctly. He could look at a piece, a print, a photograph, a document, a textile, and understand within minutes what it required to be properly preserved and presented. He had opinions about materials. He had opinions about mounting techniques. He had, over 11 years, developed the particular authority of someone who had seen what happened when framing was done badly and had decided that his shop would not be the place where that happened. He was also, occasionally, too quick to assess. It was his consistent professional failing, the tendency to form a conclusion before examining all the available evidence, particularly when the available evidence initially suggested a familiar category of object. Fragile old paper presenting in poor condition. He had seen hundreds of them. Most of them were what they appeared to be: fragile old paper in poor condition, unsuitable for traditional framing, requiring either conservation work before framing or the honest advice that framing was not the right solution. He had been wrong before. He was about to be wrong again, in a more significant way than usual. The old man had arrived on a Wednesday morning in October. He had the map in a cardboard tube, which was a better storage method than most people used for old documents. He had extracted it carefully, both hands, slow, the deliberateness of someone who had been handling this object with care for a very long time and was continuing to do so. He had unrolled it on the counter, slowly, flattening it gently with his palms. Ben had looked at it, had made his assessment, had delivered his verdict. And then the old man had said, "Look inside the folds first." The piece of paper inside the first fold was approximately 3 inches by 2 inches. It had been folded twice, once lengthwise, once across, and had been kept flat inside the fold of the map for what the paper's condition suggested was a very long time. The paper was old but less fragile than the map itself, as if it had been better protected. The writing on it was in a small, precise hand, in pencil, partially faded but legible. Ben read it twice. Then he looked at the other folds. There were 11 folds in the map, where it had been repeatedly folded to a size small enough to conceal on a person. Ben opened each one carefully, one at a time. 5 of the 11 folds contained similar pieces of paper, each one in the same small, precise hand, each one with content that Ben read once and then read again, slowly. He stood at his counter for a long moment. Then he looked up at the old man. He said, "I need to ask you some questions, if you have time." The old man said, "I have time. I've had time for this for 80 years. His name was Joseph Hensel. He was 83 years old. He had been born in 1940 in a city in what was then occupied France, in a house that no longer existed, to parents whose photographs he still had, and whose story he had spent 80 years understanding in pieces. His mother had been named Irene. She had been 24 years old in 1944. She had been, before the war, a cartographer, not a professional cartographer, someone trained in the specific technical skill of making accurate maps, but someone who had worked in a cartographic archive and had learned, through years of working with maps, to read and create them with a precision that most people did not have. This skill had become important in 1943. Joseph told Ben what he knew in the way that people tell stories they have been telling to themselves for a long time, not in strict chronological order, but in the order of what was most important, what needed to be understood before the rest could be understood. His mother had been contacted in late 1943 by the local resistance network. Not to fight, she had an infant son, she would not leave the child, but to contribute the skill she had. The resistance needed maps, not the official maps that could be obtained from any archive, specific maps. Maps of routes that the Germans didn't use. Maps of paths through terrain that vehicles couldn't navigate. Maps of the locations of safe houses, of crossing points, of the specific geography of moving people from where they were to where they needed to be. She had spent 18 months making maps. Not one map, dozens. Each one specific to a particular route or region or challenge, each one made from her knowledge of the cartographic archive she had worked in and from the specific knowledge of the local terrain that came from having grown up in the region. Each one folded to the size of a palm and distributed to the people who needed them. The map on Ben's counter was the last one. The one she had been working on in the summer of 1944. The one she had not finished distributing before the liberation came and the immediate need for escape maps ended. She had kept it. Joseph didn't know exactly why. He had theories. The map as a record of what she had done. The map as a physical manifestation of the 18 months that had been the most consequential of her life. He had been 4 years old in the summer of 1944 and had no direct memory of any of it. He had his mother's account, given to him in pieces over the years she lived, and then, after she died in 1981, the map and the notes inside the folds. He had not known about the notes until after her death. She had told him about the map, but not about what was inside it. He had found the first note when he unfolded the map to look at it properly after inheriting it. He had found all 5 notes over the course of an afternoon. He had sat at his own table with them spread out before him, and he had understood, in the specific way that you understand a thing when the evidence assembles itself in front of you, what he was looking at. He had been trying for 42 years to do the right thing with them. The notes were records, not in the sense of official records. There was nothing official about them. They were personal records, kept in the small, precise hand of a woman who had understood the value of documentation and had applied that understanding to the most important work she had ever done. Each note documented one use of the map, a date, a name or names, sometimes full names, sometimes initials only, a route designation that corresponded to a section of the map, and an outcome noted in the compressed language of someone recording facts quickly and carefully. Crossed, safe, contact made, 18 months of work, documented in 5 small pieces of paper folded inside a map. Ben read them all again at his counter, slowly, with the specific quality of attention he brought to objects he had initially misread. He had been wrong about the map. He was not going to be wrong about what was inside it. He said, "How many people used this map?" Joseph said, "The notes document 12 uses. She told me once that she believed the actual number was higher, that some of the people who used it didn't report back for various reasons. She said she kept the notes she received, but not everyone sent back a note. Ben said 12 documented uses, meaning at least 12 people who used routes on this map to get somewhere they needed to be." Joseph said, "At least." Yes. Ben looked at the map, at the faded ink, at the fold lines where the paper had separated, at the 5 small pieces of paper now lying beside it, each one a record of someone who had needed to move through difficult terrain in difficult circumstances, and had done so because a 24-year-old cartographer's assistant had spent 18 months making maps. He said, "What do you want to do with it?" Joseph said, "I want it preserved, properly. I want the map and the notes to be together, to be legible, to be protected. I want someone who understands what they're looking at to take care of it." He said, "I've brought this to 3 other framers in the past 10 years. All 3 told me the condition was too poor and turned me away. I've brought it to 2 archives. One told me it was outside their collection scope. One accepted it provisionally and then lost it. They couldn't find it in their system when I came back." He said, "I'm 83 years old. I don't have many more chances to find the right place for this." Ben looked at the map. He said, "I'm not going to turn you away." He said, "I need to tell you something first. What I can do here, the framing, the preservation, that's my part of this. But what's in these notes, what your mother did, that deserves more than a frame. It deserves a record, a proper historical record. There are institutions that specialize in this period, in documenting exactly this kind of contribution. People who were never officially recognized. People who did essential work that didn't appear in any official account because it couldn't appear there safely at the time." Joseph looked at him. Ben said, "I'd like to help you find those institutions, if you want that." Joseph said, "I've been trying to find them for 42 years. Ben said, "I know people who might know people. Will you give me some time?" Joseph said, "Yes." He said it in the way of someone who has been giving time for a very long time and has learned to do it without complaint. Ben spent 3 evenings making calls and sending emails. He was not a historian. He was not connected to institutional archives or academic departments in any direct way. But 11 years of framing work for the specific clientele that a shop on Calder Street attracted had given him a network of peripheral connections to people who collected and preserved and studied historical material. Collectors who needed framing, academics who needed work done on documents they were researching, museum professionals who brought pieces to him for the specific quality of work he produced. He called 4 people. 3 of them gave him other names. The 4th was a woman named Dr. Paula Steiner, who was a historian at a regional university and who specialized in the history of civilian contributions to wartime resistance movements, which was a field that had existed for decades but had expanded significantly in the preceding 20 years as documentation that had been sealed or lost began to surface. She answered his email within 2 hours. She asked 3 questions, all of them precise. She said, "Can I see photographs of the map and the notes?" He photographed everything carefully, sent them. She called the following morning. She said, "How old is the gentleman who brought this in?" Ben said, 83. She said, "I need to speak with him. Soon." His testimony about the context, his mother's account, what she told him, the conditions under which this material was created, is as important as the documents themselves. More important, in some ways. The documents are exceptional, but without his testimony, they're objects without full context. With his testimony, they're a complete record. Ben said, "I'll connect you." He called Joseph, explained who Dr. Steiner was and what she had said. Joseph was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "She said the documents are exceptional?" Ben said, "Yes." Joseph said, "My mother would have said she was just making maps." Ben said, "Yes, I think that's true. And I think that's part of why it took 80 years for someone to look inside the folds." Dr. Steiner came to the shop on a Saturday morning. Joseph was there. Ben had arranged for them to meet in the shop rather than separately, because the map was there, and the notes were there, and the conversation needed the objects to be present. She was in her mid-40s, the particular build of someone who spent most of their time at a desk and compensated for it with the kind of walking that came from living in a city and not owning a car. She wore a practical coat and carried a bag that held her laptop and a recording device and several notebooks. She looked at the map and the notes for a long time before she said anything. Then she looked at Joseph and said, "Tell me about your mother." Joseph told her. Not quickly. He spoke for 2 hours, Ben present and listening, the recording device running, the Saturday morning outside continuing its ordinary pace, while inside the shop something was being assembled that had been waiting to be assembled for 42 years. He told her about Irene Hensel, about her work in the cartographic archive before the war, about the period of the occupation that Ben had already heard the outline of, now elaborated with the specific details of a son's knowledge of his mother's life. About the 18 months of map-making, described with the precision of someone who had thought about this period for 80 years and had interrogated every detail he could find. He told Dr. Steiner about a specific route that appeared on the map. A route through a section of terrain in the south of France that the official military maps of the period had not accurately charted, because the official military maps had been made from survey data that predated certain changes in the landscape. Irene had known about the discrepancy because she had seen both sets of maps in the archive and had noted the difference. She had incorporated the accurate data into the route. 3 of the notes inside the folds referred to this route. 3 separate uses, 3 sets of people who had moved through that terrain on a route that only existed because a 24-year-old woman had noticed an error in a set of survey maps and corrected it. Dr. Steiner looked at the map, at the section of terrain in question, at the 3 notes. She said, "Do you know if any of the people named in these notes were ever documented in other sources?" Joseph said, "I've looked. 2 of the names I found, partial matches, people who appear in resistance records from the same region and period. But the records don't mention this route or this map. The connection is implicit rather than explicit. She said, "That's consistent with how these things were documented at the time. The people who provided support, the cartographers, the couriers, the people who opened their homes, they were often omitted from the official record entirely, or mentioned only in passing without full attribution, partly for security, partly because the official account was assembled after the fact by people who didn't always have access to the full picture." She looked at Joseph. She said, "Your mother's contribution has not been recorded anywhere in the literature I know of. What you've brought me today is, as far as I can determine, the only surviving documentation of what she did." Joseph was quiet for a long time. Ben looked at the map on the table, at the 5 notes beside it, at the faded ink and the separated fold lines and the burn mark in the upper left corner. He had held this up with 2 fingers and called it a framing problem. The framing took 3 weeks, not the standard framing. What Ben proposed, and what Joseph agreed to, was a conservation treatment followed by custom framing designed specifically to display both the map and the notes together, the notes positioned relative to the fold lines where they had been found, the whole assemblage viewable as a complete object rather than as a map with supplementary material. He worked slowly. Each fold line was carefully stabilized before the paper was mounted, the separated sections reunited with archival tissue and conservation adhesive. The notes were mounted separately, each one backed and protected. The burn mark was left as it was. It was part of the object's history, and removing it would have removed information. The frame he built was deep enough to accommodate the 3-dimensional quality of what was inside. The map's varied surface, the notes at their slightly different elevations, the whole assemblage having the quality of an object that had been lived in rather than simply aged. Joseph came in on the day it was completed. He stood at the counter and looked at it. The map was legible again, not fully, not in every section, the ink in some areas too faded to recover. But the roots were visible. The notes were readable. The fold lines were visible as fold lines, not as damage, but as evidence of use, of the object's history of being folded to concealment size and unfolded again. Joseph put both hands flat on the counter, the way he had stood the first time he came in. He looked at the framed assemblage for a long time. He said, "She carried this in her coat." Ben said, "Yes. The fold pattern is consistent with something carried folded in a breast pocket." Joseph said, "For 18 months. She carried this in her coat for 18 months. He said, when I was a child and she held me, this was in the pocket, the map that told people where to go, right there." He looked at it. He said, "She never talked about it directly. She talked around it. She said, 'During the war, I helped some people find their way.' That was all she ever said. I helped some people find their way." He was quiet for a long moment. He said, "That's exactly what she did." The piece went to Dr. Steiner's University on permanent loan. Not immediately. There was a process, a conversation between Joseph and the university's special collections team, an authentication assessment that confirmed Dr. Steiner's initial evaluation, an agreement on terms of access and preservation that took 3 months to finalize. Joseph was involved in every step, which was appropriate. He had been the custodian of this material for 42 years. He deserved to choose its final destination. The collection now held the map, the notes, and the transcript of the 2-hour conversation Joseph had had with Dr. Steiner in Ben's shop on a Saturday morning. The transcript was, as Dr. Steiner had said, as important as the documents, the oral history of what Irene Hensel had done, told by the son who had spent 80 years being the repository of the story she had never fully told. Ben attended the deposit ceremony. A small thing. University special collections didn't hold ceremonies exactly, but the department head had wanted to mark the occasion. Joseph was there with his daughter, who had driven him from the house where he lived alone, and who had, over the 3 months of the process, learned things about her grandmother that she had not known. things her grandmother had not told her either. Joseph's daughter was 56 years old, and she had her father's stillness and something of her grandmother's precision, a quality that Ben could see in the way she moved through the university's special collections room, attentively, systematically, the way someone moves through a space when they are genuinely looking at what is there. She had asked Ben, at one point during the 3 months, how he had decided to look inside the folds. He had said, "Your grandfather told me to." She had said, "But why did you listen?" 3 other framers didn't. He thought about it. He said, the way he said it, not asking, stating, the way someone states a fact they've been carrying for a long time. I've learned to pay attention to that quality. She had looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "My grandmother had that quality. My father has it. I think I have some of it." Ben said, "Yes, I think you do." She said, "What does it take to develop it? In your work, I mean. To listen to that quality in someone." He said, "Experience, and a specific kind of humility about what you don't yet know. Most of the time, when someone says something like that, it turns out to be nothing, a sentimental attachment to a piece that isn't significant in the way they hope. But sometimes, rarely, in the way that rare things are rare, it's everything. And you can't tell the difference from the outside, so you have to look inside the folds." She said, "Look inside the folds." He said, "Always." The plaque in the university's special collections room read, "The Hensel Map Collection. Maps and Operational Notes created by Irene Hensel, 1919–1981, during the German occupation of France, 1943–1944. Used to guide the movement of Allied personnel and civilians through occupied territory. Donated by Joseph Hensel, 1940, son of the creator, in 2024. These documents were preserved in private custody for 80 years. Ben had seen a photograph of the plaque. Joseph had sent it to him, the same way Margaret Voss had sent Claire Drummond the photograph of the memorial wall. A phone photograph, slightly off-center, the plaque not quite filling the frame, the surrounding wall visible. He had printed it, put it in the file he had been building since the Wednesday morning in October. The conversation notes, the authentication correspondence, the framing documentation, the deposit agreement. The file was thicker than any file he had built for a framing job. It was not really a framing file. It was the record of what happened when he looked inside the folds. He put the photograph at the front. Irene Hensel. The map. 18 months. At least 12 uses. People who found their way. Look inside the folds. He went back to work. Have you ever almost dismissed something before you understood what it was? Have you ever been the person who almost missed something extraordinary because it looked damaged and fragile from the outside? Drop your story in the comments. And if you believe that some maps lead to places that official history forgot to record, subscribe. There are more stories like this one, more folds with notes inside them, more people who carried something for 80 years waiting for someone to finally look. Look inside the folds. End of story. The Folds. 50,000 characters. Original work. 3 months after the deposit ceremony, Dr. Steiner published a paper. Not a major journal, a specialized publication focused on civilian contributions to wartime resistance movements, the kind of journal read by approximately 3,000 people worldwide who followed this area of research closely. The paper was titled, "An Undocumented Cartographic Network, Evidence of Civilian Map Production in the Southern Resistance, 1943–1944. The paper described the Hensel collection. It described Irene Hensel's background and training. It described the routes on the map and their relationship to the known geography of the resistance movement in the region. It described the notes in the folds and what they documented. It cited Joseph's oral history extensively. And it raised a question that Dr. Steiner had been working on since the Saturday morning in the framing shop. Were there other maps? The Hensel collection documented 12 uses of one map over 18 months. But Irene had told Joseph that she had made dozens. What had happened to the others? The paper was read by 3,000 people. One of them responded. She was a retired archivist named Marguerite Blanc, 79 years old, living in the south of France in a house that had been in her family for 4 generations. She had read the paper because she followed this journal because she had been a professional archivist for 35 years and old habits did not entirely release their hold. She read the description of the maps. She read the description of the fold pattern. She read the description of the notes. She wrote to Dr. Steiner. She said, "I think I may have one of the other maps." Her grandmother had kept it, not knowing exactly what it was, knowing only that it had been given to her grandmother in 1944 by a woman she knew from before the war, a woman who worked in the cartographic archive, with the instruction, "Keep this somewhere safe." Her grandmother had kept it somewhere safe for 35 years, and then given it to Marguerite's mother, who had kept it for 23 years, and then given it to Marguerite, who had kept it for 21 years, in a flat box in the back of a wardrobe in the house that had been in her family for 4 generations. Dr. Steiner replied within the hour. The exchange of emails that followed and the subsequent examination of the map in Marguerite Blanc's wardrobe confirmed what Dr. Steiner had suspected. It was one of Irene Hensel's maps. The handwriting matched. The cartographic style matched. The fold pattern matched. And inside one of the folds, one fold, one note, a piece of paper in the small, precise hand. This note was different from the others. It was not a record of use. It was addressed, not to anyone specific, to whoever might find it. It said, "If you find this, the route it documents was used 6 times between October 1943 and March 1944. All 6 crossings succeeded. The people who crossed are not in any record. They should be." Dr. Steiner sent Ben a copy of the note. He read it in the shop on a Tuesday morning. The people who crossed are not in any record. They should be. He thought about Irene Hensel, about a 24-year-old woman making maps in occupied France, knowing that the people who used them could not be recorded safely, knowing that the work itself could not be acknowledged, keeping notes in the folds of the maps so that someday, if the maps survived and someone looked inside, the record would exist. She had been making the record the whole time. She had understood that the maps would outlast the need for them, would eventually arrive somewhere that could receive what they carried, would find people who would look inside the folds. She had been right. Ben printed the note, added it to the file, behind the plaque photograph, behind the deposit agreement, behind all the other documents. He added a label to the file folder, not the standard framing job label, something else. It said, "The Hensel Maps, a record of people who crossed, who should be in a record, and now are." He put the file on the shelf behind the counter, where he could see it from the work surface. He went back to work. Joseph came back to the shop in December, not for a framing job, just to come back. To sit in the chair Ben kept for clients who needed to sit and look at what was being done, to be in the space where the map had been. He sat in the chair. Ben worked at the bench. After a while, Joseph said, "My mother used to say that maps were optimistic objects, that by definition they assumed you were going to get somewhere, that you wouldn't make a map of a route you believed was impassable." Ben kept working, said, "She was right." Joseph said, "She made maps for people who had no other option, people for whom every other route was closed. She made them optimistic objects. She assumed they would get somewhere." Ben said, "And they did." Joseph said, "Yes, 12 of them that we know of, more that we don't." He was quiet for a moment. He said, "I want to tell you something about the day I first came in here." Ben set down his tools. Joseph said, "I had been to 3 other framers. All 3 told me the condition was too poor. I had been to 2 archives. 1 turned me away. 1 lost it. I had been carrying this for 42 years, and I was beginning to think, I was beginning to think that the right place didn't exist, that the map would go the way of the maps that didn't survive, that my mother's work would remain what it had been for 80 years, something known only to me, held in private, without a record. He said, "And then I came here, and you picked it up with 2 fingers, and I thought, again, another framer who sees a condition problem. And I said, look inside the folds, and you looked." Ben said, "You knew I would." Joseph said, "No, I hoped you would. There's a difference." He said, "What made you look?" Ben thought about it, about the specific quality of how Joseph had said it, about the stillness of the hands on the counter. He said, "The way you said it, and the way you placed the map on the counter, both hands, slowly. That's not how you handle something you think is worthless. That's how you handle something you've been taking care of for a very long time." Joseph nodded. He said, "That's the thing, isn't it? The way you handle something tells the truth about what it is, even when you can't say what it is directly." Ben said, "Yes." Joseph looked at the bench where Ben was working. At the current job, a series of botanical prints for a client, entirely ordinary work, the careful standard labor of making something last. He said, "My mother would have liked you." Ben said, "I would have liked her." Joseph stood up. He moved with the careful deliberateness of very old age, the specific economy of someone who has learned to move efficiently, because efficiency is what the available resources require. He said, "The other map, the one in France. Did Steiner tell you what they're going to do with it?" Ben said, "It's staying in France. The archivist, Marguerite Blanc, is donating it to a regional archive in the south. There will be a display. The 2 maps, digitized, shown together as what they are, pieces of the same network." Joseph said, "They'll be together." Ben said, "Yes." Joseph said, "Good. That's right. Maps from the same hand should be together." He left. Ben watched him go through the shop window, moving down Calder Street at the pace of someone with somewhere to be and no reason to hurry. He went back to work. The botanical prints were waiting. Ordinary work, done carefully. He thought about maps, about the difference between a map that documented a route and the route itself, about what it meant to be the person who made the map rather than the person who used it, about 18 months of making optimistic objects in a place where optimism required enormous courage, about a 24-year-old woman who had put the record in the folds, who had understood that the map would survive the war, would survive the immediate need, would eventually arrive somewhere that could receive what it carried, who had made the record the whole time. He picked up the first botanical print, assessed it, began the work. In February, a woman came into the shop. Late 30s, professional clothes, the build of someone who spent significant time outdoors. She was carrying a tube similar to the one Joseph had used. She said, "I found a map in my grandmother's things. She died last month. The map is old, and I don't know exactly what it is. I was wondering if you could look at it." Ben said, "Of course." She extracted the map from the tube, unrolled it on the counter with both hands, slowly, the deliberateness of someone handling something they recognized as old and fragile. Ben looked at it, assessed its condition, made his initial evaluation. Before he said anything, he said, "I'm going to check the folds." She said, "The folds?" He said, "Yes. Old maps sometimes have things inside them, notes, records, things that were kept there because the fold was a safe place to keep something." He opened the first fold carefully. Nothing. The second fold. Nothing. The third. A small piece of paper, folded twice, pressed flat by time. He unfolded it, read it. He looked up at the woman. He said, "Can you tell me about your grandmother?" She said, "She was French. She came to this country in 1952. She never talked much about the war." He said, "What was her name?" She gave him a name he didn't recognize. but the hand on the note was the same small, precise hand. The pencil marks were the same. The paper was the same age. He said, "I think your grandmother knew someone who made this map." She said, "What do you mean?" He said, I think there's a story here, and I know someone who will want to hear it." He picked up his phone, called Dr. Steiner. The maps kept surfacing. The record kept growing. Irene Hensel's network was larger than the single map that Joseph had carried for 42 years. It was reaching out from the folds, one piece at a time, assembling itself into something that had always been there, waiting to be found by the right people looking in the right places. Ben worked at his bench on Calder Street. He looked inside every fold of every old map that came through his door. He always would. The second map led to a third, not directly, through the chain of connections that Dr. Steiner was building with the patience of someone who had spent 20 years in a field where patience was the primary professional requirement. The woman whose grandmother had come from France in 1952 had a cousin. The cousin had a photograph. The photograph showed two women standing outside a building that Dr. Steiner recognized from another source as a location connected to the resistance network she had been documenting. One of the women in the photograph was Irene Hensel. Not identified in the photograph, Dr. Steiner had to identify her from the description Joseph provided and from the specific quality of the way she was standing, which Joseph confirmed when Dr. Steiner showed him the photograph. The other woman was unknown. The unknown woman had been, the cousin thought, a neighbor. Someone who had lived nearby before the war and after. Someone whose name had been mentioned occasionally, but whose story had never been fully told. Dr. Steiner found her through the archival record. A woman named Claire Morel, born 1918, died 1997. A schoolteacher who had taught in the same region for 40 years. Who had been, according to the sparse post-war documentation, a friend of the resistance. The vague honorific given to civilians who had contributed without being members of formal networks, without formal recognition, without the specific documentation that would have allowed their names to appear in the official record. The third map was in her family. Her daughter, now 70 years old, living in the same town where Claire Morel had taught, had kept it in the same way, knowing it was old, knowing it had been important, not knowing exactly why or how. She had kept it, she told Dr. Steiner, because her mother had told her to keep it. She had said, "This map helped people. Keep it safe until someone who understands comes along." Dr. Steiner had come along. She called Ben. He drove 3 hours to look at the map. Not because he had to. The woman could have photographed it and sent the images. But because he had learned, in the preceding months, that looking at the object itself was not the same as looking at photographs of the object, and that the difference sometimes mattered. He looked at the map. He checked the folds. There were notes in 4 folds. The same small, precise hand. 4 more records of routes used, people moved, crossings succeeded. He sat at Claire Morel's daughter's kitchen table in the south of France with the map and the notes spread out before him, and he thought about a network of women in occupied France making maps and teaching and keeping records in the folds, and telling their families to keep the maps until someone who understands comes along. Someone who understands. He understood. He had learned to understand by looking inside the folds, by listening to the specific quality of how Joseph Hensel had said it on a Wednesday morning in October, in the shop on Calder Street. Look inside the folds first. He photographed everything carefully. Called Dr. Steiner. Arranged for the conservation and eventual deposit of this third map with the others. He drove home through the French countryside, a landscape that was utterly different from the city where his shop was, and yet carried in its geography the traces of what had happened there. The terrain that Irene Hensel had mapped with such precision, the routes that she had documented with such care, the paths that had been used by people who were not in any record and who should be. He thought about the difference between making something and preserving something and finding something. 3 different contributions, all necessary. Irene had made, Joseph had preserved, Ben had found by looking inside the folds. And now Dr. Steiner was building the record, assembling the network from its surviving pieces, one fold at a time. The network that Irene had built 80 years ago, distributed across the folds of maps that had been kept by families who had been told to keep them safe until someone who understands comes along. Someone always came along in the end. It just took time. Ben drove back to Calder Street, unlocked the shop, turned on the lights, made coffee. The queue was waiting. The ordinary work of preserving and presenting objects that people brought to him, each one carrying its own history of being made and used and kept. He worked through the queue carefully, the way he worked through everything. And when someone brought him an old map, when the tube came through the door and the map was extracted with both hands and unrolled on the counter, he said the same thing every time before he said anything else. He said, "I'm going to check the folds." He always did. Ben's shop had a wall where he put things, not a display wall, not in the commercial sense. A working wall behind the counter where he kept the things that reminded him of what the work was actually for. The photograph of the Hensel collection plaque was there. Joseph's phone photograph, slightly off-center, the plaque not quite filling the frame. Beside it, a printout of the note from the second map, the one that said, "The people who crossed are not in any record. They should be." Beside that, a photograph of the 3 maps displayed together at the regional archive in France, digitized and printed large, the 3 fold patterns visible, the routes legible, the notes, photographed at high resolution, readable in the display. 3 maps, 5 notes in one in another, 4 in the third. 10 pieces of paper in a small, precise hand, pressed flat in the folds for 80 years. Irene Hensel's network. The record she had put in the folds because she had understood that the maps would survive and would eventually arrive somewhere that could receive what they carried, that someone would look inside. Ben stood at the counter in the morning before the first client arrived and looked at the wall. He thought about the Wednesday morning in October, about the map held up with 2 fingers, about the professional no he had been preparing to deliver, about 3 words, "Look inside the folds." He had looked. Everything else had followed from that. He put on his apron, turned to the queue. He had work to do. Spring came to Calder Street. The street continued its slow transformation. Another storefront renovated, another one holding on as it was. The framing shop in the middle, not renovated, not declining, simply continuous. 11 years of the same work done carefully in the same space. Ben had a new habit with old maps. When one came in, and they came in with some regularity, this being the kind of neighborhood that attracted the kind of people who kept old things, he spent the first 5 minutes simply looking, not assessing the framing requirements, just looking. At the map itself, at the condition, at the fold pattern, at the way it had been brought in and placed on the counter. Then he opened the folds. Most of them held nothing. The folds were just folds, the ordinary creases of a document that had been folded for storage or transport. He noted this and moved on to the framing assessment. But 3 times in the 8 months since Joseph Hensel had first brought in his map, he had found something inside a fold. The first time, a dried flower, pressed flat, no note, no identification. He had photographed it, preserved it carefully, and asked the client about it. The client didn't know what it was. They kept it with the map. The second time, a small printed card for a shop that had been on a street in a city he didn't recognize. He researched the address. The shop had closed in 1958. The client, who had inherited the map from a great-uncle, didn't know the connection. They kept the card with the map and said they would look into it. The third time, a handwritten list. 6 names, no dates, no context. He photographed it and sent the photograph to Dr. Steiner as a matter of routine. She had not yet found any connection. She was still looking. He was still looking too. That was the practice. Not every fold yielded something significant. Most didn't. But the practice of looking was its own value. The commitment to not concluding before examining completely, the discipline of checking before dismissing. He had passed the habit on. Not formally. He had no apprentices, ran no training programs. But Joseph's daughter had started working part-time in a regional archive, and she had adopted the fold-checking practice for old documents in her care. Dr. Steiner had mentioned it in a paper as a practical technique for initial examination of folded historical documents. 2 colleagues at other shops had heard about what he had found and had started doing it themselves. A small practice, a specific habit, spreading through the community of people who handled old paper objects, one conversation at a time. Look inside the folds. Ben worked through a Tuesday Q, a large format print for a photographer, a series of certificates for framing as a gift, a textile that needed careful assessment before he could propose a mounting solution. Between the certificates and the textile, a woman came in with a cardboard tube. She was perhaps 65. She placed the tube on the counter with both hands. He said, "Let's see what you have." She extracted the map, unrolled it slowly, placed it flat. Ben looked at it. It was old, 18th century perhaps, a coastal survey, the style consistent with that period. The condition was reasonable for its age. The cartographic work was competent rather than exceptional. He said, "I'm going to check the folds." She said, "Of course." He opened the first fold. Nothing. The second. Nothing. The third fold. He felt something. Not paper this time. Something small and flat and hard, pressed between the 2 layers of the fold. He opened the fold carefully. A coin. Small, worn, the face barely legible. He picked it up with his tweezers and placed it on the examination cloth. He looked at it under the loupe. He looked up at the woman. He said, "Can you tell me about this map?" She said, "It belonged to a sailor, my great-great-great-grandfather. He was a surveyor's assistant. He made this map on a voyage in 1783. Ben looked at the coin. At the year worn into one side, still legible, 1783. He said, "He kept a coin in the fold." She said, "Yes, I always assumed it was just something that ended up there. A coin in a pocket, a coat folded around the map." Ben said, "It might be. Or it might be that he put it there deliberately, as a marker, as a record of where he was and when." She said, "Like a message in a bottle." He said, "Like a message in a fold." He set the coin down beside the map, looked at the 2 objects together, the map that documented a voyage, the coin that marked a year, kept together in the fold for 240 years. He said, "Do you want to frame them together?" She said, "Can you do that?" He said, "Yes, I know exactly how." He picked up his notebook, started planning the work. The Tuesday Q continued. The work continued. Calder Street continued outside, in the spring light of a city that had been built on the labor of people who had mapped it and measured it and documented it and kept their records in the places that records survived. Ben worked at his bench. He was good at his work. He was getting better at the specific quality of looking that the work required. He looked inside every fold. He always would.